Yeah, so we're going to break it up, and the first part of the Kennedy presidency will be the early years. We will go through this and tell you some things he did early in his presidency. And then something that happened early in his presidency was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that's a whole nother story and a lengthy story, so we'll split that up into another test material. And then when we get done with that, we'll split up Kennedy's civil rights years, what he did as far as civil rights, and then we'll be into the trip to Texas and the assassination. So it's a long, drawn-out period, and rather than try to get you to remember all of that at one time, we'll split it up. So we're going to talk about the Kennedy presidency, the early years, and tell you about the administration of President Kennedy. Now, what was Franklin Roosevelt's administration called? New Deal.
That's right.
Fair deal. Modern republicanism, right? And the name of the Kennedy administration will be the New Frontier. We call the New Frontier. Now, Kennedy's administration, or the New Frontier, had 4 objectives for the United States. 4 things that he wanted to do during his administration. So Kennedy's New Frontier had 4 objectives for the United States. The first objective for the New Frontier was to build up the military using conventional weapons. Okay, what are conventional weapons? What? Non-nuclear, okay? So he wanted to build up the military with conventional or non-nuclear weapons. What else do you think the Kennedy administration wanted to do in some of the things we've talked about late in the 1950s? Wanted to pass the Russians in what? The race for space. So another goal of the New Frontier was to pass the Russians in the race for space. The third thing, or third objective of the New Frontier, was to provide medical care for the elderly. Provide medical care for the elderly. And you are benefiting from the fourth objective for the United States, something that had not been done much prior to that, is you want to provide government money for education. Okay, so the 4 objectives of the New Frontier were to build up the military with conventional weapons, in other words, non-nuclear weapons, to pass the Russians in the race for space, to provide medical care for the elderly, and to provide government money for education. Now that's going to take us to another subtopic which is important, and that's the presidential cabinet of John Kennedy. And historians say that he probably had and still has the most balanced cabinet that any American president's ever had. What do I mean by balanced? Democrats, Republicans, okay? Now I'm going to tell you all the members of his cabinet because they all come into play sooner or later between now and the end of this discussion on John F. Kennedy. Okay, we should know who his vice president is. Who's his vice president? Yeah. Lyndon B. Johnson, who was a former Senate Majority Leader. Very, very popular politician from Texas. But he was the Senate Majority Leader prior to becoming Vice President. And I'll tell you right now, he lost power moving into the Vice Presidency politically, because he was the most powerful man in the Senate at the time and took over the Vice Presidency. So he had very good experience with his Vice President, although he didn't use him a lot. We'll get into that. Who was a former Senate Majority Leader and a very popular politician from Texas. We can start looking at the board over here a little bit. His Secretary of State was this fellow right here in the Time magazine, Dean Rusk. Dean Rusk was his Secretary of State. And he was a very quiet, calm Republican from Georgia. He was a very quiet, calm Republican from Georgia. Of course, Kennedy's Democrat, so here you go, you're balancing. He was a quiet, calm Republican from Georgia, and at the time that he was selected as Secretary of State, he was serving as president of the Rockefeller Foundation. He was serving as president of the Rockefeller Foundation. Your Secretary of Defense under President Kennedy was this fellow right here, Robert S. McNamara. Robert S. McNamara. And he was a Democrat, native of California. And during the time of his selection, he was serving as president of Ford Motor Company. He was serving as president of Ford Motor Company. Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara, a Democrat, native of California, at the time of his selection was president of Ford Motor Company. Now that was kind of a big deal. He was named president of Ford Motor Company in 1960, just before all this election happened and his appointment. Yes?
Okay, so you said his last name was McNamara, but it's MC on here, but is it M-A-C?
McNamara.
Yeah, so it's an
Do I have it spelled wrong?
You have it M-C-N-A-M-A-R-A. Is it M-A-C?
No, it's M-C-N-A-M-A-R-A. Yep.
Okay,
Now, the reason that was of importance is because when he was named president of Ford Motor Company in 1960, he was the first non-Ford family member ever to serve in that position. So they must have had some great confidence in him because he was the first one in the history of Ford Motor Company to serve as president who was not a member of the family. But he didn't stay in that position long, obviously, because he was appointed that position in 1960, and then he took over as Secretary of Defense after Kennedy's inauguration in January of '61. His Secretary of the Treasury, this fellow right here, C. Douglas Dillon, very wealthy Republican, very wealthy Republican. He was a New York investment banker at the time, a very wealthy Republican and New York investment banker. And to give you an idea of his worth, once in his life, he donated $20 million to the New York Metropolitan Museum. That's the kind of money this guy had, okay? So his Secretary of the Treasury will be a Republican and wealthy New York investment banker, C. Douglas Dillon, who once donated $20 million to the New York Metropolitan Museum. He knew a little bit about finances. Kennedy's press secretary was Pierre Salinger. We'll get to know him over the next many weeks here. Pierre Salinger. Now, the video we watched, the first half of A Making of the President in 1960, you saw Pierre Salinger in there many times. You didn't really know who he was, but he was a close associate of the Kennedy family. He helped with the campaign of John F. Kennedy, obviously, for the presidency. He also was the campaign manager for Robert Kennedy's bid for the presidency in 1968. Very close family friend, and he's the press secretary. What does the press secretary do there, Rasmussen?
The press.
He deals with the press. He will announce things that the president doesn't want to announce himself. And you got to have a guy there you can trust, so he doesn't say something to get you in trouble or say something stupid. And so Pierre Salinger was a great choice. Did the Kennedys tell him every single thing? No. Only the things they wanted out to the press did they tell Pierre Salinger. But he's a very close family friend and served as campaign manager for Robert Kennedy's bid for the presidency in 1968. The national security advisor that was selected by President Kennedy was McGeorge Bundy. McGeorge Bundy. Here's a picture of and a signature of McGeorge Bundy right there. National Security Advisor, McGeorge Bundy. He was another Kennedy loyalist. And he was a former professor and dean at Harvard University. So National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy. He was a Kennedy loyalist and a former professor and dean of students at Harvard University. He also had a specific speechwriter in his cabinet. His name was Theodore Sorensen. Theodore Sorensen's up on the board too, if you guys want to come up and take a look at these people. Theodore Sorensen. He was a lawyer and a writer. And we consider him an inner circle advisor. What do I mean by an inner circle advisor?
You knew everything?
Well, he didn't maybe know everything, but he was one of those guys that Kennedy surrounded him around that maybe didn't have a big position in the cabinet that he could really trust. And so he may go ask Theodore Sorensen something, an opinion, as a speechwriter that you'd think he would ask the vice president. So he was in the inner circle. Okay, he was in the inner circle. He also wrote speeches for Kennedy when he campaigned for the Senate, and he was the main speechwriter for him when he ran for president. So it only made sense for him to bring him on board as his main speechwriter when he was president. So he had been with President Kennedy throughout, writing speeches for the guy completely through his political career, Theodore Sorensen. Okay, there were 2 CIA directors during the Kennedy presidency. 2 CIA directors. First one was Allen W. Dulles. Allen W. Dulles. And then he was replaced by John McCone. John McCone. So Kennedy's first CIA director, which he inherited from who? Who's the president before Eisenhower? And then John McCone. The one we talk about most is McCone. He was the deputy to the Secretary of Defense under President Truman. He was the former deputy to the Secretary of Defense under President Truman. And he replaced Allen Dulles when Kennedy fired Dulles after something we'll study called the Bay of Pigs affair. Okay? So Dulles is going to be fired and replaced with John McCone, who was a former deputy to the Secretary of Defense under President Truman. And Dulles was fired directly after the Bay of Pigs incident, which we'll talk about later, because Kennedy was upset at him and replaced him with John McCone, who would stay with Kennedy throughout his presidency. Then, again, 3 other men within the inner circle, okay? And he just kind of gave them jobs. The first one, his title was Special Assistant to the President. And his name was Lawrence O'Brien. Lawrence O'Brien. He was a special assistant to the President. Lawrence O'Brien is up here. Lawrence O'Brien is also known as he later years became commissioner of the NBA. But at this time, he was a special assistant to the President. And his job was to communicate with members of Congress for the President. So if the President wanted a vote here, a vote there, wanted something done from a congressman or a senator, he would send Lawrence O'Brien to do his talking. So Lawrence O'Brien's title was he was a special assistant to the President. He communicated with members of Congress for the President, and later, after the Kennedy years, became commissioner of the National Basketball Association. The next 2 are probably Kennedy's closest friends, who were also special assistants to the President. The first one was David Powers. David Powers. David Powers. And his job, he was the Assistant Appointments Secretary to President Kennedy. He was the Assistant Appointments Secretary to President Kennedy. And he was a very, very close personal friend of the President. Very close to the President. Maybe his closest aide in the end was David Powers. Okay? The next person in the cabinet was another special assistant to the President, Kenneth O'Donnell. And you'll hear a ton about Kenneth O'Donnell, especially when we get into the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kenneth O'Donnell, special assistant to the President. What do you think his job was if Powers was Assistant Appointment Secretary? He was the Appointment Secretary for President Kennedy, which was just kind of a facade. I mean, did he schedule his appointments? Yes, he did. But in essence, he was one of his closest advisors inside the walls of the White House. Now, he was a close friend of President Kennedy, but he was very, very close to Bobby Kennedy. So he was best friends with Bobby Kennedy, which made him close to President Kennedy. But so you might say that David Powers was President Kennedy's closest friend, and Kenneth O'Donnell was a very close friend, but he was Robert Kennedy's closest friend, Kenneth O'Donnell. Now, those 2 men in 1972, after the president was assassinated and they got on with life a little bit, they wrote a book entitled Johnny We Hardly Knew Ye, which is a very, very good book. And if you look at the back cover here, you can see the president with both David Powers in the middle and Kenneth O'Donnell on this side. And I do have a picture on the very top up there with both fellas' signatures. But anyway, they were the closest aides that President Kennedy had. It was kind of interesting last year because, and you'll get this too, before the year's out, I'll get you kids all I like to get a vintage book for you. And every once in a while I'll bring you in one, and by the end of the year you all get one. And so I decided to pass a few out last year, and I bought them for like $2-3 because the used ones are kind of, I like the vintage rather than buying you a new book. And so I write a little note to you in there, and then I put them on your desk. And here come Taylor Nielsen, who just loved her book. She picked it up and opened up and read the little thing I wrote, and then she opened up the next page and she smiled, and she opened the next page, and the book was signed by both Kenneth O'Donnell and David Powers, the person that kind of like another one of those deals. So we got online, I think the cheapest one you could find online was like $850.
Huh.
And so she said, "Oh, Mr. Durr, I think you should probably have this back." I said, "No, today is your lucky day." I had no idea. I paid $2 or $3 for it. So you never know. If you buy books, look in those front covers. You might not know what you see there. Anyway, Kenneth O'Donnell. Now listen, we'll talk more about him. The final position we'll talk about, and an interesting position, was that of Attorney General. And John Kennedy chose his brother, Robert Kennedy, to be the Attorney General of the United States, which was a little strange. So his choice for Attorney General will be Robert F. Kennedy. And the reason it was strange is that Robert had really never served much as a lawyer. He served only briefly as a lawyer in the Justice Department prior to this appointment. So he had very little experience as a lawyer at all, yet the president's going to pick him to be the top lawyer in the country. Okay? Now, Robert's job over these years wasn't as a lawyer. He was the campaign manager for his brother John Kennedy for the House, for the Senate, and for the presidency. That's what he did. Remember, they came from a wealthy family. They didn't really need jobs. But that's what Bobby Kennedy did, is he campaigned for his brother all these years. And then Robert Kennedy was appointed Attorney General. Well, a lot of people were critical of that choice. He had very little legal experience. Why in the world would that happen? But here comes the Kennedy wit. Because, of course, Kennedy's asked about it, not like he would be in the media today, but he was asked about why he would pick his brother, and he said, quote, "I see nothing wrong with giving Robert some legal experience as Attorney General before he goes out and practices law on his own." So, I mean, this guy's going to be the most powerful lawyer in America, and that's how he brushes off the criticism and say, "Nah, I don't see what's wrong with giving him a little experience before he goes out and practices on his own." The trouble is the experience is going to be as the top lawyer in the country. That's a little Kennedy wit. So, why did he pick his brother? Well, he has no legal experience. Tristan, give me one reason why he picked his brother.
Does he tell him when he's wrong?
That's exactly right. He knew he would give him an honest answer. And we're going to see that as an example during the Bay of Pigs, which we're going to talk about pretty quick. Very good, Tristan. Knew he would always give him an honest answer. Sage, what would be another reason he'd pick his brother? He knew he'd always give him an honest answer. It's just like Mr. Sanford. If I don't agree with him and he comes and asks me my opinion, do you think we should do this? I'm going to give him an honest answer. And then he gets to decide whether he listens to me or not. We've talked about this before. But he knows that I'll give him what I think is an honest answer. Why else would you pick your brother, Sage?
Maybe because he would be loyal to you?
Absolutely. He knew he could trust him. He knew he could trust him. He wasn't going to do anything to harm him. Disloyalty. Very good. What was the third reason, Siobhan? Think about what we've talked about. The dynamics of this family of Kennedys. Why is the third reason he picked
His
him?
father.
His father told him to. And his father didn't tell him to just to be mean. His father told him to pick him because he knew he would be loyal and he would give him an honest answer, and he knew he could trust him, and he knew his son needed that type of person in the cabinet. So those are the three reasons why John Kennedy picked his brother. He knew he always could trust him, he knew he would always give an honest answer, and he was pressured or told to by his father. Now, historians will tell you that Bobby Kennedy probably was, without doubt, the president's closest advisor during the time that he served as president. And he actually turned out to be a very forceful and efficient Attorney General, despite the fact that he had very little legal experience. So there is the Kennedy cabinet. You'll hear a lot about these people as we go through the Cuban Missile Crisis, civil rights, the trip to Texas, the assassination, etc. Any questions at all on the Kennedy cabinet? Okay, that'll take us to our next subtopic, which is the formation of the Peace Corps. All of you heard of the Peace Corps in here? I'm sure you have, yeah. The Peace Corps. Did all of you know in here that John Kennedy established the first Peace Corps? Anybody know that? What's that? Said in the video, yeah. Well, on March 1st of 1961, President Kennedy announced the formation of the Peace Corps, which was set up as a temporary government agency. So on March 1st of 1961, President Kennedy announces the formation of this new Peace Corps, which was set up to be a temporary government agency. What I mean by temporary government agency is Kennedy asked Congress to evaluate this temporary program, and if it was successful, make it a permanent program, which obviously it must have been successful because it still exists today. Okay? Still exists today. Now, the Peace Corps was set up at the time to provide these two things to developing nations. First of all, Pete, what's a developing nation? Well, it's a nation that's fairly maybe primitive to a point, that maybe aren't up to what we would consider standards, that they're developing into a country, so they're going to be lacking some skills. Okay? So the two things that the Peace Corps was established to provide these developing nations were humanitarian aid and education.